Chapter 42. In the giant ballroom, where the nobles had been gathered, Sinon and Coleridge met in the middle. Their forces had swept through, eliminating all of the assassins, and subduing the guards. "It looks like the room's clear," Coleridge said, glancing around. "Shall we move to the halls?" About to agree, Sinon suddenly froze, her cloth-covered eyes turning to look into the distance, as if she could see straight through the walls that surrounded them. "No," she said, her voice quiet, but intense. "Gather everyone, and prepare to evacuate. We need to get out of the palace as soon as possible." In the small room, where Garrett was monitoring everything, his eyes snapped open, and he looked at Rin. "I need you to head down to the basement," he said, "and find a way into the room with the mysterious artifacts. When I give a command, you need to take down that massive crystal." "What about you?" Rin asked. "If I'm not here, who's gonna protect you?" "I can protect myself," Garrett said. Though Rin clearly didn't like the idea of leaving Garrett alone, she bit her lip and nodded, and a moment later was gone. Garrett pushed himself forward, rolling to the door leading into the next room, which he opened and passed through. When he arrived at the next door, he hesitated for a moment, and then grabbed the handle and threw it open, only to find himself face to face with Edward and the Queen, who both froze when they saw him. "Your Majesty, you're safe," Garrett said, his face pale. "There are enemies everywhere." Even as he spoke, his eyes took in the carnage in the room behind them, and he blanched further. A frustrated expression flickered across Edward's face as he stared at Garrett. He had been hoping to find help, but instead, all he had found was the Queen's crippled friend. "Are you okay?" the Queen asked as she approached Garrett. "Yes. Thankfully, I was near the door, but the fighting in the ballroom was intense." "We can chat while we're moving," Edward said, his eyes scanning, heading towards a door that would lead into the hall. "Come on, we need to get out of the palace as soon as possible." Seeing Garrett struggle to wheel himself along, the Queen grabbed the handles of his wheelchair to push him. But at that moment, the door that Edward had been about to open was destroyed, causing him to stumble backward as he warded off the splinters of wood flying through the air. 4 royal guard rushed through the door, spreading out to surround Edward and the others. Gritting his teeth, Edward launched himself forward, attacking immediately as he tried to catch them off guard. He managed to hit one of them in the chest, throwing him back out into the hall. But another of the royal guards jumped towards him, slashing down with his sword, while the other 2 ran towards the princess and Garrett. Desperate to protect the princess, Edward tried to retreat. But the royal guard he was fighting pressed in, not letting him get away. "Take them both alive." Just before the royal guards arrived in front of the princess and Garrett, a sinister voice spoke from the hall, and the 2 royal guard abandoned their attacks, instead, grabbing the princess and Garrett roughly. A figure stepped into the room from the hall, hands behind his back, his face covered by a sinister mask, and his body shrouded in a long crimson cloak. The mask, which covered the man's entire face, was comprised of a single vertical eye that glowed with an eerie red light, and caused everyone who looked upon it to shiver. Cold and clammy air surrounded the man, filling the room and causing everyone's movements to slow. "Bring them along," the sinister figure commanded, and the 2 royal guard began to drag Garrett and the Queen away. Edward let out a furious shout, but before he could intervene, 6 more royal guard rushed into the room, driving him back. Every time he tried to break free, they would surround him, keeping him from escaping. The masked man looked at Edward for a moment, and then turned on his heel, walking calmly out of the room, as the struggling Queen and Garrett were dragged away after him. Garrett's wheelchair lay on its side, abandoned in the corner of the room, while Edward desperately fought for his life. The halls were filled with the same clammy mist that surrounded the crimson-masked man. The Queen couldn't help but shiver as they walked along them. Everywhere Garrett looked, he saw destruction and sensed nightmares. It seemed as if the entire palace had been invaded by them. As they passed by an open doorway, they could see half-transformed servants engaged in a macabre feast. One of the monsters heard them and turned its head. It appeared to have once been a maid, but now her eyes had fused together in the center of her face, transforming into a giant crimson eye, much like the one on the mask of the red-cloaked man. She held a grisly arm, torn from the body at her feet, and blood dripped down from her chin. When she saw the man in the red cloak, her hiss transformed into a cry of fear, and she cowered back, clearly frightened of the power he wielded. They continued through the palace, climbing a set of stairs, until they reached the upper chambers. Here, the situation was the same, and multiple times they passed by grotesque, half-human, half-nightmare monsters who roamed the halls. Entering a small room, Garrett and the princess were thrown on the couch, and the two guards that had dragged them along retreated to stand by the door. The masked man considered them for a moment, and then took a seat across from them. Just then, the door opened, and four figures, wearing masks of their own, walked into the room. Unlike the man in the robe, however, they were dressed in noble's attire, allowing Garrett to immediately identify each of them. The man in front was portly, and wobbled slightly as he walked, almost as if he was drunk. As he stopped in front of the queen, he executed a sloppy bow. "Well, hello, your majesty. You seem to have found yourself in quite a pickle." The queen's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing into a glare. "What is the meaning of this, Baron?" With a laugh, Baron Galavin removed his mask, and leered at the queen. "This is the result of years of schemes, executed quite beautifully, if I must say so myself." From the flush on his face, and the glassy look in his eyes, it was clear that he had been drinking heavily. Whether in celebration, or to give himself courage, Garrett didn't know. "For years, we have been planning to seize the crown. The time of the monarch has passed, and if you had died, as you were supposed to, during the event 6 months ago, we wouldn't have had to stage this play you see before you. You could have saved the lives of countless innocent people. But no, you decided to cling to power, decided that it was your right to rule over the rest of us. But your pathetic attempt has failed. You couldn't even get back into power without us, and yet you wanted to lord over us. Never again will we submit to the tyrant's heel. Never again will we allow our fates to be controlled. No, if anyone is going to control others, it's going to be us." The three other masked noblemen laughed along as Baron Galavin chuckled. "Where is my uncle?" the princess demanded. "What have you done to Duke Arkov?" "Oh, the Duke is fine, at least for the moment. He's having a nice long dream, and after he runs himself ragged, well," Baron Galavin paused, and then drew his thumb across his neck as he flashed a vicious smile. "But rather than worry about him, you should worry about yourself. After all, he's not going to come and rescue you, and you're here by yourself." Glancing at Garrett from the corner of her eye, the princess was stunned to find that Garrett simply wasn't there. Before she could panic, however, a calm voice spoke in her mind. "Just relax. You're safe." Though she had no idea where Garrett's confidence came from, or where he had gone, the princess found herself calming down. Baron Galavin didn't notice, as he turned to address the man in the crimson robe. "Thank you for your hard work, but we can take it from here." Slowly, the man in the crimson robe stood up, the large eye on his mask turning to stare at each of the four noblemen in turn. "What of my reward?" he said, his voice causing the queen to shiver. "You'll get your reward," Baron Galavin said, growing annoyed. "Don't get full of yourself." "I'm afraid it's too late for that," the man said calmly, taking a step toward the Baron. "I'm afraid it's much too late for that." "What are you doing?" one of the noblemen asked, reaching out to shove the man back. Before his hand connected, the robed man moved with unearthly grace, slipping past the shove and stabbing the nobleman in the chest with the long curved dagger he had hidden. With superhuman strength, he tore the dagger free, sending a gout of blood flying up to splatter against the ceiling. Before anybody could react, he was on to the next, cutting another of the nobleman's heads from his shoulders. The third followed a moment later, the long curved dagger protruding from his forehead, the blade piercing his brain. Slowly, the man in the crimson mask turned to face Baron Galavin, who was shaking in terror. "You," the Baron said, but didn't manage to finish the rest of the sentence as the masked man waved his hand, slitting the Baron's throat. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he said, watching as Baron Galavin clawed at his throat and then collapsed. After the Baron stopped twitching, the masked man turned to the princess, who sat, her face pale but calm, on the couch. and here I thought you would have used this opportunity to try and run away," the man said. "Could I?" the princess asked. With a laugh, the masked man shook his head. "Though you could have tried, you certainly wouldn't have succeeded. Your wisdom and poise continue to impress me, Your Majesty." "How much longer am I going to hold that title?" the queen asked, causing the masked man to chuckle once more as he returned to sit across from her. "That depends a bit on you and the Duke," he said, the eye on his mask shifting towards a nearby doorway that hung open. Through it, the princess saw an astounding sight. The air seemed to have been folded on itself, transformed into a prism that reflected the figure of Duke Arkov, his face filled with fury as he remained trapped in place. Despite his fierce expression, his eyes were closed, almost as if he was asleep. Stifling her urge to call out to him, Eloise knew that it would do no good. Just then, a voice sounded in her heart. "Get ready." Though she didn't know what she was getting ready for, Eloise took a deep breath. In the basement under the palace, the heavy door sealing the Room of Mysteries swung open slowly, and a shadowy figure slipped through. "I'm finally inside," Rin muttered, and almost immediately came the command, "Attack the artifact." She had no idea why Garrett would command such a thing, but she still obeyed, sending a wave of shadows that grew around her like two powerful wings, surging into the glowing crystal. As soon as the shadows hit the crystal, it flashed with a bright light that nearly blinded her, and a wave of physical force ripped through the room, throwing both her and all of the mysterious artifacts against the walls. The crystal shook, and suddenly, rainbow light fused together in its center. With a groan, Rin struggled to her feet, and spat a glob of blood from her smashed lips. "Oof, I'm gonna be feeling that for a week," she said, able to feel the bruises beginning to form on her body. The crystal, which before her attack had been glowing weakly, began to burn with bright, multicolored light that reflected against the haze-covered mirror shards above it. For a moment, the haze resisted, but then, under the bright, shifting light, began to burn away, revealing the gleaming mirror surface. Once more, all around the castle, things began to shift and change. The gloomy fog that filled the corridors rapidly evaporated. Simultaneously, scattered across the first floor, pots filled with flowers shattered and dozens of flower ghouls crawled out of them. Immediately, a new war started, this one between the flower ghouls and the nightmares that had invaded the palace. Unlike the first battle, which had been almost completely one-sided in favor of the nightmares, this battle rapidly turned into a rout. The flower ghouls chased down the nightmares and leapt upon them, devouring their mental energy. Some of the transformed monsters tried to fight back, but any time they got close to the flower ghouls, their movements would slow. Their eyes grew entranced by the beautiful waving petals before they were savagely ripped apart, often without even resisting. The man in the crimson mask, who sat across from the queen, let out a long hiss, unable to understand what was going on. Abruptly, he lunged across the distance that separated him from the queen, another long dagger appearing in his hand. Yet before he could stab her, the crown she wore glimmered with multicolored light, forming a shield that blocked the attack. Screaming, she tried to scramble backwards, but he followed up with a second attack, causing the light covering her to dim. There was a savageness to his movements, and just as she feared she wouldn't be able to survive the third thrust, a long strand of hair wrapped around the masked man's arm, throwing him into the wall. The queen felt an arm wrap around her waist, and heard a soft voice at her ear. "Your hair is beautiful, Your Majesty. I'd love to comb it." Frozen in fear, Queen Eloise couldn't resist as she was lifted up off the couch, held tightly in Isabel's arms. The masked man bounced up from where he had been thrown, his broken arm letting out cracking sounds as it twisted back into place. "How dare you interfere," he hissed, and the eye on his mask began to wriggle. Immediately, the air split open, and a dozen ethereal eyes appeared around him, each one filled with madness. Chapter 43. Everywhere the strange crimson eyes looked, space twisted, and the princess felt a piercing pain in her stomach when one eye glanced at her. Before the pain could get worse, a strand of hair spun into a needle, stabbed through it, causing it to fade away, and taking the pain it had caused with it. With a roar, the masked man launched himself forward, more eyes appearing around him, as he attempted to fight his way through the sea of hair between him and the queen. Isabel, who had been hiding in the charm Garrett had given the princess for the last month, fought furiously, trying to eliminate each of the eyes as it was manifesting, while also blocking the masked man's path forward, letting out a shriek that caused him to stumble backwards. She held the queen with one arm as she pointed her other hand forward. There was a flash of silver as a mysterious needle shot towards the man's mask, but the large vertical eye glanced at it, causing it to bounce away, as if struck by a physical force. The chaos, which had largely died down in the palace after the princess was captured, erupted once again, as Garrett's supernatural forces battled against the masked man's nightmares. Though the masked man and Isabel were evenly matched, Garrett had no attention to spare for them. He was currently sitting against the wall in the room where Duke Argov was trapped, desperately trying to undo the effect of the mysterious artifact that kept him in place. Garrett had plenty of experience with liminal spaces, between the hollow space and the mirror controlled by Isabel and Kabod's maze, which he actually had on him. This, however, was a completely different matter, as there didn't seem to be an object it was tied to. Instead, whatever the masked man had activated had pulled the Duke into the dream world, forcing him into a space inside his mind that consisted of only the single room he had been in, making it impossible for him to escape. Garrett had been examining it for the last few minutes, and was at a loss. Had there been a mysterious artifact for him to deal with, he was confident that he could have at least disrupted it, but the folded space in front of him felt as if it would devour him entirely if he got too close. Wishing for the umpteenth time that he had the Dreamer's Throne, Garrett finally took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and sent a strand of mental energy into the prism. The Dreamer's Throne was without a doubt his greatest advantage, yet Garrett knew that he couldn't wait until it was available to deal with this. As risky as it was a risk he had to take. To Garrett, it felt like he had stepped into a world of mirrors. Everything bent around him, replicated millions of times in every direction. As soon as he entered, he felt the familiar air of the dream, and stood up, his finger twitched, and a dream flower bloomed at his feet. He could see Duke Argov in the distance. Yet the problem was, there were millions, maybe even billions, of copies of the Duke, spreading out in front of him. Garrett had no idea how many iterations of the same room the Duke had been through, but he had a suspicion that the Duke was burning through them as fast as possible. Taking a step forward, he created another dream flower, planting it at his feet. One step after the other, he proceeded into the fractured world, leaving a trail of dream flowers behind. After walking for a minute, he stopped and turned to look behind him, where there should have been a single dream flower. There were dozens, which quickly multiplied to hundreds, and then thousands. The longer he looked, the more dream flowers he saw, until they filled his vision. "Well, that's not good," he muttered. Feeling a hint of a presence behind him, Garrett turned and saw a sight that chilled him to the bone. Hanging in the air was a single vertical crimson eye that blinked slowly. It carried the aura of the crimson eye of Shemoreth, and it widened ever so slightly as it caught sight of Garrett. "You are that thief." Even as the voice rippled around Garrett, his surroundings changed, transforming into a wide, empty space. Realizing he had just been pulled into a mental landscape, Garrett saw the eye in front of him had transformed into a tall woman whose beautiful body was shrouded in a sheer red dress. Her face was perfect, and all the more inhuman for it. And above her closed eyes, in the middle of her forehead, sat a vertical crimson eye that stared at Garrett emotionlessly. "We finally meet. Tell me, what is your name? Isn't it more polite to introduce yourself first?" Garrett asked, doing his best to calm his racing heart. The woman's lips rose into a perfect smile, creating a creepy feeling when combined with the emotionless eye on her forehead. "I suppose you're right, though one doesn't normally treat a thief politely. But have it your way. My name is Caries, Crimson Eye of Shemorth. I can't say I'm pleased to meet you, Caries, but my name is Garrett, Dreamer on the Throne." For a moment, the inhumanly emotionless eye trembled, revealing fury and a hint of terror. As quickly as the emotions had come, they were gone, and Caries took a step toward Garrett. "Will you return to me what you stole?" "What's that?" Garrett asked. I don't remember stealing anything. No? You don't remember destroying one of my eyes? Because I remember it. I remember it, as clear as if it was yesterday. Holding up his hand to forestall her next words, Garrett tilted his head to the side. Tell me though, how clearly do you remember yesterday? After all, it's in the past, so it's likely you got some details wrong. I mean, let me see if I can refresh your memory. I was in my home when all of a sudden you attacked me, trying to possess me with your so-called baleful eye. I'd just like to point out that the name in and of itself indicates how terrible it is, and when I tried to defend myself, you tried to drag me into oblivion. I was just defending myself. Furthermore, even after I defended myself, you tried to kill me again, sending one of your chosen to possess my friend, something I still haven't forgiven you for. In fact, you took Shemorith's power. Okay, I'll admit, maybe I did that. But, again, not my fault. I didn't choose which of your powers to take. Otherwise, I would have picked something you didn't care about. How was I supposed to know you deeply cared about this particular ability? Even as he was talking, Garrett's mind was working furiously, trying to analyze the space around him. Kara's mental power was different than the mental power of the great rulers he had encountered before. It wasn't weaker by any means, but it didn't feel stronger either. Instead, it was as if it was more integrated with the world around it, making it subtle and harder to pin down. That made it challenging for him to identify where her presence actually was. For though she was standing right in front of him, Garrett could tell this wasn't actually her body. Instead, she was somewhere else, and simply projecting this mental space in order to speak with him. This may have been because her true body was so far away. Though he didn't know where her territory was, it was clearly outside of the city, at least according to the map Karin had given him. You can make any excuse you want. That still doesn't absolve you of taking what was mine. Does it help if I say I didn't do it? Garrett asked, continuing to try to buy time. If I'm honest, it's the throne that's been running the show. Kara's emotionless eyes stared at Garrett for a moment, and then her lips turned down in a frown as she shook her head. Enough playing around. I want to know how you're going to compensate me. Fine, Garrett said, taking a breath. I'll tell you what. This is what I'm going to do. After I destroy every hint of your presence in this city, I'm going to come and find where you live. Any territory that you have captured, I will take, integrating it into my growing kingdom. And then, once you are reduced to only a single territory, I will find you and I will destroy that. Considering your attempts to kill me and what you've done here, I think that's about fair. Her eye flashing with anger, Carries covered her mouth and chuckled. The ambition of the weak is so amusing. You can't even free yourself from this mental landscape. How do you think you're going to come and find me? Garrett just smiled and pointed his finger at the long shadow that extended from under his feet. Die. The word rolled off of his tongue, landing with physical presence, shattering the world around him as his shadow screeched in agony, crimson eyes opening all over it. The emotion in each eye was different, but as the shadow was twisted by the power of Garrett's command, more and more of them transformed from anger and disdain into fear and terror. The image of Carries opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but before she could, her body cracked apart, joining the shadow in death. As the air shifted, Garrett found himself back in the prism, his head pounding from the exertion of wielding the throne's force through his soul spark. Gritting his teeth as he fought through the piercing pain in his head, Garrett spoke once more. Shatter. An overwhelming force erupted from him as his soul spark unleashed its energy, smashing the scattered images and causing them to fracture. Without hesitating, he turned and ran, his feet landing on the trail of flowers he had left behind. Even though there were thousands of them spread out, the ones he had planted called to him, ushering him out into the waking world. With a gasp, his eyes snapped open, and he felt a trickle of blood running from his nose. Wiping it with his sleeve, he breathed as deeply as he could, trying to ease the pain running amok in his skull. In front of him, the folded space shook, a large crack running down it. And then, with a bang, Duke Arkoff was free. His presence exploded outward, blasting through the walls and roof of the room, completely obliterating a huge chunk of the wall as stone was sent flying into the distance, and blowing off the roof. Realizing he had finally escaped, Duke Arkoff let out a loud shout, causing every living being in the city to feel a deep sense of fear. A massive sword manifested in the air behind him, and everywhere Duke Arkoff looked, the world seemed to peel away, as if cut by a blade. The man in the red mask had still been fighting against Isabel when the Duke stepped from his prison. And when he heard the furious roar, he shivered. Even as the Duke's gaze swung over, he frantically tore at the air in front of him, producing a thick gash that opened like a crimson eye, diving through just before the Duke's gaze landed where he had been standing. The eye was only half closed when it was torn apart, cut to shreds under the weight of Duke Arkoff's aura. Isabel was still holding the Queen tightly, protecting her. With the dregs of his mental energy, Garrett commanded her to retreat. Moving so fast it looked like he teleported, Duke Arkoff suddenly stood in front of Isabel, his hand reaching for her, past the Queen's head. Isabel's body flickered as she retreated to the flower pendant. But before she could jump away, the Duke frowned and grabbed it. Seeing that he was about to crush it, Queen Eloise shouted for him to stop. "Don't harm her. She was protecting me." Her shout came just in time to save the small pendant from being crushed into a million pieces, likely taking Isabel along with it. Duke Arkoff looked around once more, the sword behind him thrumming, as the door was ripped apart. "Follow me," he said, as he began to walk out of the room. Her face pale, the Queen followed, while Garrett, who was lying as still as possible in the room Duke Arkoff had just left, desperately sent commands to the flower girls to retreat. As the Duke walked through the palace and witnessed the devastation, his anger grew. Yet strangely, he found not even a single enemy alive. By the time he reached the ground floor, he had seen hundreds, all half-eaten or drained of their life force. Yet not a single living creature appeared in front of him. Garrett, who was still up in the room where Duke Arkoff had been trapped, finally let out a sigh of relief as the last of the flower girls slipped away. Quite a number of them had died in the fight, but he had had their companions drag their bodies down into the earth to repurpose in the nest. It was unfortunate that he hadn't been able to take the rest of the bodies as well, but Garrett knew better than to push his luck. He was just trying to pull himself toward the edge of the ruined wall when a dark shadow poked up over it, flowing into the room before rising to reveal Rin. "Wow, you look rough," she said, flashing a wide smile as she looked Garrett over. Her gaze turned to the ruined room and the massive hole in the wall and ceiling, and she let out a long whistle. "This wasn't you, right? I mean, I know you're strong, but..." Interrupting her, Garrett shook his head. "No, it was the Duke. But we don't have time to mess around. We need to go." "Sure. Come along," she said. Crouching next to him, she picked Garrett up and then whirled around, before dashing to the edge of the room and diving out through the hole Duke Arkoff's aura had formed. Massive black wings snapped open on her back, catching the air just before they began to fall, allowing them to glide forward. The wind whipped at Garrett's hair and clothes, and he felt a lurch of vertigo as he caught sight of the ground slipping past almost 200 feet below. But Rin kept a good grip on him, and after a moment they were already over the palace wall. "Hold on," she said, and the wings behind her suddenly tucked as she dove down towards the city below. Chapter 44. The drop caused Garrett's stomach to flip, but after only a second the wings snapped open once again, rapidly slowing their descent, until Rin, light as a cat, landed on the roof of a home in the noble district. Still holding on to Garrett, Rin rapidly scaled down the wall of the building, entering an alleyway. After a few turns they emerged onto one of the main streets, which was packed with people, and a minute later a carriage pulled up, with Og nodding at them from the driver's seat. They piled in, and with a crack of his whip the horses lurched forward. Though the streets were busy, Og kept the horses moving at a rapid pace, scattering people right and left, until they finally pulled into a quieter neighborhood, soon arriving at a relatively simple-looking brick home. When Rin opened the door she had changed, and was wearing a simple black suit with a gold mask. Og tossed the wheelchair down to her, which she caught and placed on the ground, before helping Garrett out of the carriage and into it. Garrett had changed as well, though he didn't wear a mask, like she did. They proceeded to the house, entering through the unlocked front door without knocking. Once inside, Garrett closed his eyes for a moment, and then gestured toward the back of the home. "He's in the library." At an unhurried pace, Ren pushed Garrett's wheelchair down the hall and into the small library Victor Klein normally used. There was nobody in the room, but Garrett pointed to a figurine on the mantel, and after Ren pulled it, the entire fireplace, which still had a fire burning in it, shifted to the side, revealing a narrow hallway, just wide enough for the wheelchair to pass through. At the end of the hallway was a door, which Garrett leaned forward and opened, causing the man in the room, who was busy packing a bag, to freeze. Shock covered his features as he spun around, a long curved dagger in his hand, his eyes staring wide at Garrett and Ren. If the curved dagger wasn't enough proof, a discarded robe, crimson in color, and a red mask that had a crude vertical eye running the length of it, lay discarded on the bed. In silence, Garrett watched his father, Victor Klein, as the man tried to find something to say. Suddenly Victor's breath seemed to come back, and he straightened up, tossing the dagger onto the bed. "How long have you known?" he asked, as he calmly began to pack once more. "Since I met you," Garrett said, after sending the letter. "The deal you made leaves marks." With a forced laugh, Victor sat down on the bed, his eyes flicking to the gold-masked woman behind Garrett. He felt as if she was shrouded in shadow, making it impossible to get a good reading on her strength. But that didn't matter. He knew that he was outmatched. "And here I thought you were on my side." "In a way, I am," Garrett said. "After all, I'm not going to allow you to condemn yourself to a fate worse than death." "But you will condemn me to death." "Oh, undoubtedly," Garrett replied calmly. "So much for the bonds of family." Victor's words contained a hint of bitterness, but Garrett just chuckled. "You erased the bonds of family long ago, father. Have you been planning your revenge since then?" "Truthfully, no. I was just happy to be out from under your thumb. But then you decided that the power that came along with being steward wasn't enough, and you set your sights on my people." "You mean the princess?" "Queen," Garrett corrected. "Besides, the being you made a deal with is a mortal enemy of mine." This time, it was Victor's turn to laugh. "Your enemy? You speak as if you're somehow equals. The power she wields is beyond anything you can even imagine, son." "There I'd have to correct you," Garrett said. "My imagination's pretty good. And besides, having faced her 3 times, well," Garrett spread his hands and smiled. "I'm doing pretty well." "Will you let me go?" Victor asked. "No," Garrett replied, shaking his head. "Then will you at least kill me? I'd rather die by your hand than another. After all, it would be in keeping with the Klein family traditions." "Those traditions have ended with your generation, father." "No, I won't dirty my hand with it. Instead, you'll face the royal family to account for what you have done." "Do you think that wise?" Victor asked, a gleam flashing through his eyes. "If you leave me alive, you never know, I might turn things around." "Now that is an impossibility," Garrett said, slowly lifting his hand. Victor, staring uneasily at Garrett's finger, which was extending toward him, suddenly reached down and grabbed the dagger, trying to hurl it at Garrett. It flew through the air straight and true, stabbing towards Garrett's chest. But before it could touch him, a wave of black feathers swept in between its sharp point and Garrett, wrapping it up and casting it off to the side. At the same time, a bright burning seed of mental energy shot into Victor's head, rapidly growing and maturing until 6 blooms exploded from it, unfurling their rainbow brilliance. Crimson streaks began to appear as the remnants of the crimson eyes that had been planted in Victor's body tried to emerge. But the flowers went to war immediately, wrapping roots around them to prevent them from opening and biting down on them with teeth hidden by their petals. Victor screamed, flopping back on the bed as his soul began to tear. But Garrett's finger remained outstretched and a spark of white flame jumped to Victor's body, beginning to repair the damage as life force surged into him. For 10 minutes, Victor wailed in agony, but the room was well hidden and nothing could be heard beyond its walls. When the eyes were finally defeated, he rolled from the bed to the floor, struggling to get up, his eyes gleaming with a rainbow of colors. The catastrophe at the palace had ended, and thanks to the protection offered by Sinan and the Gravewalker gang, along with Coleridge and Cleaver's Edge, the majority of the nobles had been spared a grisly fate. Additionally, the supernatural entities who had swarmed through the palace had been killed, and the shield that was supposed to block their entry into the palace had been restored. It was only when its power surged through the palace that Duke Arkoff and the Queen even realized that it had been compromised. When the Queen stepped out onto the steps of the palace to address the nobles crowded down below, cheers rose. The sight of Duke Arkoff standing firmly behind her, his raging aura barely suppressed, caused immense relief in the hearts and minds of those who had gone through the tragedy. Though the Duke suggested she rest, Queen Eloise would have none of it, and clutching the flower pendant Garrett had given her in her hand, she walked to the palace wall, where she had planned to address the crowds that afternoon. The explosion at the palace had sent rumors swirling through the city, and almost 100,000 citizens had gathered, stretching in all directions. When they saw their new queen appear on the wall above the gate, a tremendous shout rose, filling the entire city. It contained exuberance and happiness, as well as a clear sense of relief and a hope for the future. For almost 20 minutes, the shouting continued, until Duke Arkoff clapped his hands together, forming a wall of sound that radiated over the crowd, silencing them. The wave of silence spread as Queen Eloise lifted her hands. "My dear citizens," she said, her voice amplified through a mysterious artifact placed on the wall in front of her. "I stand before you today as your new queen with mixed emotions. In truth, it was not by choice that I took up this position. And with every fiber of my being, I truly wish that my father or even my older brother still lived, so that they might stand before you and address you today. But fate is a twisting thing, never content to leave us in peace and prosperity. Yet even as fate attempts its tricks, I know that it will not be able to overthrow us. Though many are its schemes, we stand strong. Even now, seditious elements attempted one final effort to wrest control of this city from our hands. From your hands. But thanks to the brave efforts of many of our citizens, they have been defeated once and for all. You may hear rumors in the coming days of what happened in the palace today. But know this, the only thing that matters is that we still stand strong. No matter what fate throws at us, we will not falter. We will continue to grow and improve, continue to spread peace and prosperity until we have formed a city the likes of which this world has never seen. It is my great honor to serve each and every one of you as your queen." Clasping her hands together in front of her chest, Queen Eloise bowed, her head so low it nearly touched the stone wall in front of her. Down below, the citizens clapped and cheered, their voices rising once more. Straightening, Queen Eloise stood tall, an easy smile on her lips, as she gestured. "For the next 3 days, let us make merry." Even though they had already begun the celebrations, this was the signal the citizens had been waiting for, and a great shout rose up as the people prepared to party. Inside the palace, it was not so joyous, and it was almost 4 hours before Duke Arkoff allowed any of the nobles to leave. One by one, they were brought in for questioning, which he carried out personally, his immense aura causing more than one terrified noble to confess their crimes, even though they had nothing to do with the attack that had just happened. Those who were found to be blameless were allowed to leave, and they quickly hurried off to begin attending the social parties that they had been scheduled to participate in. The Duke had made it abundantly clear that no one was to ruin his niece's ascension celebration, and that he fully expected each and every one of the nobles to demonstrate just how happy they were in the coming days. The nobles could smell the blood in the air, and knew exactly which way the wind was blowing, so they hurried to assure him that nothing would please them better. A few hours after the attack had ended, a nondescript carriage pulled up next to the palace gate, and 3 figures got out. The first was Victor Klein, who looked immaculate as always. Turning around, he helped Ren down, and then the 2 of them assisted Garrett in getting down. The guards standing in front of the gate hesitated to let them in, until a servant from the Duke ran over to instruct them to open the gate. The Duke was still in the middle of interrogating the nobles, and it was an additional 2 hours until he was finally free. When he walked into the waiting room where they had been passing the time, His aura was back under control, though it flared slightly when he saw Victor. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Taking a deep breath, Victor didn't respond and instead looked at his son, a rainbow sheen flashing across his eyes. "Your Eminence, might I speak first? As long as what you have to say is worth me listening to, I don't see why not." Garrett could tell he was on thin ice. The Duke was furious, both with the failure of the palace defenses and of the nobles, who should have been the first to protect the royal family but instead seemed eager to watch it be eliminated. "I would request that you listen to me until I'm finished speaking," Garrett said, "as it's likely that what I'm going to say will cause you intense anger." The Duke's eyes narrowed as he transferred the entirety of his attention to Garrett, yet to his surprise, the young man didn't flinch even a little. Though Garrett was sweating internally, his outward expression was completely calm, helped in large part by the power of the Dreamer's throne that thrummed through him, isolating him from the weight of Duke Arkov's aura. Ever since he had unleashed the power of the throne against Kerry's, the Crimson Eye of Shemoreth, Garrett felt as if he had made a breakthrough, and had begun to touch on the manifestation stage, understanding how he should manifest his aura, allowing his soul spark to directly impact the world around him. Though he could barely scratch the surface of its power, just that was enough to shield him. Taking a deep breath, Duke Arkov nodded. "Speak, and I'll judge whether what you're talking about is worth my time." "Thank you." As the Duke listened, Garrett started at the beginning, explaining what he had discovered about the Black Raven assassins who had been smuggled into the city to initiate the first attack. When the Duke heard that his stationery and seal had been used to issue the orders, his face paled and fury caused the air around him to crackle. Remembering Garrett's warning, he forcefully suppressed his anger and gestured for Garrett to continue. Next came Garrett's explanation of the various forces that had intended to finish the job they had started, using him to eliminate his niece, only to find their plan untenable when he had instead embraced her return and offered the throne to her wholesale. After that, Garrett spoke of the plan his father had wanted to carry out, and the corruption of his soul by a mysterious power from outside the city. He explained how he had discovered the oddities in the mind crystal, and about how after the event had started that morning, he had realized that it had been compromised, and so he sent Rin to go and reset it, though he didn't explain how that process had taken place. Finally, he explained how his father, under the control of the Crimson Eye of Shemoreth, had tried to kill the Queen. The Duke's anger had settled into a cold, hard rage. "Tell me," he said when Garrett fell silent, "why I shouldn't just tear your father to pieces right now." "If that is what you wish to do, then by all means, do it," Victor said, bowing to the Duke. "Though I was possessed, there is no excuse for my actions. I am guilty of each of those crimes, and I do not shy away from taking responsibility for them." Chapter 45. A flicker of confusion flashed through the Duke's eyes as he heard Victor's calm and forthright declaration. To him, it appeared that Victor was being completely honest, lending credence to the idea that Victor's actions hadn't been his own. But the idea that Victor Klein had been controlled by some sort of nefarious force was a terrifying thought, since Duke Arkov hadn't detected anything of the sort. Troubled, he glanced at Garrett, but before he could speak, the door opened and the new queen swept into the room. "Garrett, there you are," she said. "You wouldn't believe how worried I was about you when you disappeared." "How did you disappear like that?" Wincing, Garrett kicked himself for not reminding Aloys to talk to him about it when he was out of the Duke's earshot. Smelling a story, Duke Arkov stared at Garrett, his eyebrows slowly rising inch by inch until Garrett thought they might merge into his hairline. "It sounds like there's something you haven't mentioned to me yet," the Duke said. Doing his best to smile disarmingly, Garrett shrugged. "I don't have combat powers, at least directly, but I do have a sort of connection with the mysterious." "Is that how you got a guardian spirit for Aloys?" "Yes, in fact," Garrett said, grasping the explanation like it was a life-saving rope. "That's exactly right. It also gives me some other abilities, like the ability to remove myself from people's attention for a short period of time." "That reminds me," the Duke said, turning to look at Aloys, "this pendant of yours. I want to take a look at it." Clutching the flower pendant protectively, Eloise stared warily at her uncle. "I'm not going to break it, I promise. I just want to understand it." This time, Garrett was relieved that he had already ordered Isabel to retreat, so when the Queen finally did hand it over, and Arkoff examined it, he didn't find anything unusual. Since the Queen already carried a dream flower seed, Garrett didn't feel the need to add anything to the pendant. So while it had a hint of energy to it, left by Isabel's time hiding in it, there was nothing else unusual for Duke Arkoff to find. After looking it over, the Duke tossed it to Garrett. "Let's see you summon that guardian spirit." "The pendant won't work anymore," Garrett said, looking rather forlorn. "It takes time to set up, and the spirit isn't here anymore." It was clear that Duke Arkoff smelled something fishy, but didn't quite know how to pin it down. Walking over next to Garrett, the princess took it from his hand and crouched down next to him. "Thank you, Garrett. Without it, I wouldn't be alive." Though he grumbled, Duke Arkoff couldn't argue against that truth, and so he dropped the matter. Garrett had already proven himself time and again to be loyal to the throne, and Duke Arkoff knew that if he continued down this line of questioning, he would end up doing more harm than good. That left, however, what to do with Victor and all of the noble families who had participated in the attack. Seeing that Victor was standing quietly by the side, the Duke shook his head and sat down. What a mess. What an absolute mess. On the first day, too, Eloise said, sitting down next to the Duke and rubbing her forehead. "If I had known this is what it meant to be queen, I would have stayed in Port Reverie." "Don't worry," the Duke said, chuckling. "Tomorrow will be a lot better, and if it's not, then I'll join you in going to Port Reverie." "But what do we do now?" Eloise asked, looking around. "I'm not sure," Duke Arkoff replied ruefully, rubbing his chin. "You know, your father was always much better at all of this than me, which is why he was the king, and I was just his dumb brother. I was good at hitting things. Still am. So if there's an enemy army marching our direction, or a beast wave coming from the mountains, I'm your guy. But all this political stuff just gives me a headache." "Me too," whispered Eloise, patting her uncle on the knee. "But good thing we have somebody who seems to like it." Turning on her smile full force, she turned and batted her eyelashes at Garrett. "Oh, Garrett." "Yes, Your Majesty? What do you think we should do to be able to clean up this mess?" "If I may be so bold, Your Majesty, I think this is less of a mess and more of a wonderful opportunity." "Opportunity? How do you figure?" "Simply put, the story you tell the citizens will determine how this event is viewed. Additionally, you have the opportunity to change the power structure in the city for the better without depleting your resources." Sitting forward and resting his elbows on his knees, Duke Arkoff gazed intently at Garrett. "Explain." "Imagine with me two different scenarios," Garrett said. "The first is that you take the route typical royal families would take in this scenario." "You mean we kill the families of anybody involved in this debacle and confiscate their goods?" "Exactly. You could take their wealth wholesale, property, people, money, all of it. And you could eliminate them, forever removing their families from the city. However, while you can do that, there is a cost associated. Distrust from the other nobles, fear from your citizens, a general sense of unease or a lack of stability. It was these things that led us to the situation in the first place. And that isn't to say there isn't a time and place for wholesale slaughter, but I'm simply suggesting that now might not be that time. To mark the beginning of a rule with bloodshed bears ill omen." "But what's the alternative?" Duke Arkoff asked. "Do we just let them go? Remain unpunished?" Smiling, Garrett shook his head. "No. Instead, you kill them with kindness, guaranteeing their loyalty. The nobles who died in the room with the Queen did so at the hands of the enemy. They were simply doing their duty to protect the Queen from his blade. Their wives, children, and all of their assets will remain safe. In fact, you go one step further and you reward their heirs. Wouldn't that just encourage more dissension?" Eloise asked, her forehead furrowing as she tried to understand what Garrett was getting at. "It would, if they weren't aware that you were aware of their father's duplicitous deeds. They know their father has committed an unspeakable crime. And yet, as they sit terrified in their home, word comes that not only is the crown aware of their father's deeds, but in her mercy, the queen is willing to overlook them for the sake of peace. The only reason the queen would do such a thing is for one of two reasons. First, she truly is a good person, in which case the emotion evoked would be one of loyalty. Second, she simply isn't worried about another betrayal, invoking fear. The combination of these two is a tremendously powerful deterrent. It has the additional benefit of keeping the beginning of your reign free from blood. Now, of course, this will only work if there is actually a villain upon which to pin the crime. As the room fell silent, Eloise and Duke Arkov looked at each other, half in disbelief that Garrett had just come up with such a plan and half wondering where they would get a villain. Both of their questions were answered a moment later when Victor stepped forward. I would be willing to volunteer myself to act as catalyst for this plan. Though I was under the influence of a mysterious entity, I still bear the guilt for my action, and so it is only right that I pay for my crimes. Seeing the queen glance over at him, Garrett held up his hand and shrugged. His choices are his own, but you can be certain that what he does for the kingdom. You realize that if you go to the chopping block, you'll dishonor your family, including this son of yours, Duke Arkov said coolly as he stared at Victor. I do, Victor replied, his voice completely calm, which is why I would ask one final grace from the queen. Turning around, he walked back to the end of the couch where there was a small bag and picked up a bundle that he unrolled, revealing a crimson cloak and a red mask. I have no right to ask this of you, but if you feel merciful, please allow me to be executed in anonymity. Though it seemed that the Duke wanted to reject him, he ultimately turned to Eloise, awaiting her decision. The silence stretched until it felt as if it had been minutes since the last sound was uttered, and the entire time Victor remained bowed. With a deep breath that hid a sob, Eloise nodded. You have wrought truly terrible things upon me and upon this city, but out of consideration for the many years of service during which you proved a faithful servant, and more importantly for the sake of your son, blameless in all of this, I will grant your request. You will be executed by Duke Arkov, and what remains of you will be burned outside of the city. But you may rest assured, knowing that the Klein family will not end with you. Thank you for your merciful judgment, my queen. Take him away. At Queen Eloise's order, the Duke stood up and gestured for the two guards at the door. The mask was slipped onto his face so nobody would see him, and he was taken out of the room. I'm proud of you, the Duke said to the queen as she bit her lip, trying not to cry. You're more merciful than I, which bodes well for the future of our city. Turning to Garrett, he patted him on the shoulder. The official word will be that your father has retired and gone to another city to recuperate from an injury. Unfortunately, he'll pass away along the path. Thank you for your kindness, Your Eminence. It's not my kindness, kid, the Duke said, flashing his shark-like smile. After he had left, Queen Eloise took a moment to gather herself before speaking to Garrett. I really do want to thank you for everything that you've done. I don't know the extent of it, but I know that it is more than I have any right to expect. Not only did you risk your own safety, but you risked the safety of those under you. I would be honored if you would continue to serve as your father did, as the steward of the royal family, though right now that's just me. Bowing his head, Garrett spoke firmly. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I have no desire to hold the position of steward. Oh. Garrett didn't have to look up to know that Eloise was disappointed. However, he said, you have my loyalty, and I am happy to work behind the scenes for you. I have long come to realize that my abilities are most useful when out of the spotlight. So that means I can still talk to you, Eloise said, her voice much more chipper. Indeed, so long as I don't remove it, the power to communicate mentally will remain. I'm happy to advise Your Majesty on any subject you feel my expertise will be of assistance in. Okay, that makes me feel a lot better, Eloise said. I thought for a moment you were going to run away and leave me all alone. You have the Duke, Your Majesty, as well as Henrietta and your other friends. You need not fear being alone. I know, Eloise said, pouting slightly, but for some reason, I just feel better knowing that you're not going to ignore me. Keeping his expression as calm as possible, Garrett's eyes flickered to the 5 blooms that hovered above Eloise's head. Internally, he was screaming, and not in a good way, though none of that showed on his face. He had planted the dream flowers in Eloise's mind as a means of enabling them to communicate, but had never considered what would happen as her trust towards him grew. As it did, her soul spark naturally nourished the flowers, and when she became queen, the explosion of energy that had been infused into her soul spark caused them to grow even faster. The only saving grace was that she had willingly chosen it, instead of being forced into loyalty. Realizing he was going to have to modify his plans, Garrett pretended that he was considering something. Noticing his hesitant look, Eloise waited, and finally, with a sigh, he turned to Rin. "Rin, would you mind showing the queen your mask?" Though she was unsure why Garrett was asking. Rin nodded and complied, pulling her golden mask from her waist pouch. As soon as she saw the flower, the princess's eyes lit up. "What is this?" she asked. At Garrett's mental prompting, Rin began to explain. "I am the chosen of a great being." Her eyes flickered to Garrett, but thankfully, the queen was so busy looking at the mask that she didn't notice. "And this, great being provides me power in exchange for helping with certain tasks." Unsure why Garrett had brought the subject up, the queen passed the mask back to Rin, and turned to look at Garrett. "Our actions today were because that being, called the Dreamer on the throne, wished for you to survive, and establish a stable rule in this city. The mysterious entity that possessed my father was another of these great beings, but one who wanted the city to fall into chaos. One of the powers these great beings can give is protection from other mysterious entities." Though he spoke in a roundabout manner, Eloise was smart enough to know what Garrett was getting at. Reaching up, she clutched the pendant Garrett had given her, feeling the 5 petals as her eyes lingered on the 5-petaled flower on the mask. "You said that this dreamer on the throne can protect us from other malicious entities?" "Yes," Garrett said. "It's not commonly known, but there exists a world beyond this world, a world full of those malicious entities, called nightmares, and these nightmares constantly seek to enter the real world, in order to wreak havoc." "And this dreamer, what does he want?" the queen asked, her voice quiet. "He asks all sorts of things, really," Garrett said, rubbing his cheek. "I don't know." "Rin, what does he ask you to do?" "Well," Rin said, "he asked me to compile a list of all of the nobles, all of their dirty laundry, and who's connected with who, and then he asked me to present it to you, your majesty, as an ascension gift. You'll find it on the desk of your study." Chapter 46. Rin has a particular set of skills that are very useful, Garrett said. But more importantly, everyone that the Dreamer on the throne picks is someone who is very useful. Seeing that the princess was still looking troubled, Rin walked over and sat next to her, taking her hand. This startled Eloise, but after a moment, she relaxed. "You really should join us," Rin said directly. "It's tremendous fun. Plus, if you asked, you could probably get the same kind of position I have. One of the things I didn't mention is that this mask allows me to enter into a magical space that's in that other world. And once there, I can talk to others who have also come. Oh, and did I mention you can get stronger too?" Garrett watched dumbfounded as Rin prattled on. With every word, the princess's eyes grew brighter and brighter. He had only ever considered presenting the pros and cons of the situation, but to listen to Rin talk, it was a secret club full of grand adventure that served as a gateway to a world filled with mystery and power. Realizing that he had misjudged Her Majesty's romantic streak, Garrett could only admit defeat when within a few minutes of sitting down next to the Queen, Rin had completely convinced her. "And you really think that the Dreamer on the throne will accept me as one of his chosen?" "Don't worry," Rin said, patting the Queen's hand. "I have a considerable amount of sway with him. He definitely will listen to me, and I think you would make a great candidate for another chosen." "Then I'll do it," Eloise said, her eyes shining. She kept Garrett and Rin there for a few more minutes, chatting excitedly about the prospect of joining them in the dream world and asking all sorts of questions of Rin, until a servant came and informed her that she had other appointments to keep. With a sigh, she stood and bid them farewell, but not before making Rin promise to put her name forward for consideration as a chosen of the dreamer. Rin couldn't stop smirking the entire way back to the inn, but Garrett remained silent until they had actually pulled into the yard. "Well done," he said. "I didn't realize Her Majesty was such a romantic. And I never realized your face would look so funny when you were forced into something you hadn't been planning on doing," Rin said, laughing. That night, just as Rin had promised, Queen Eloise found herself in a dream standing in front of a simple door decorated with a dream flower. As she entered, she found herself in a large stone hall, empty save for a giant figure on a throne at the other end. The feeling gave her an intense sense of familiarity and comfort. She walked forward, coming in front of the great throne where she found a golden mask hovering in the air. "Welcome," a deep voice intoned. Try as she might, she couldn't make out the features of the figure on the throne, but the feeling in her heart convinced her that he held no ill will towards her. "Is this the mask?" "Yes," the figure said. "However, think long and hard before you take it. If you do, you'll be opening yourself up to a world full of danger." There was a certainty in the giant's voice that caused Eloise to hesitate, but then, the magical words Rin had spoken earlier that day of adventure and mystery filled her heart, and she slowly reached for the mask. Once she touched it, she felt as if an electric shock had run down her arm, and she almost withdrew her hand. Sitting on the throne, Garrett was racking his brain for a way to convince her not to take it. He hadn't originally intended for her to be a chosen, and had only spoken of the dreamer on the throne because he wanted to give her some assurance that she would be protected from malicious, mysterious entities. Rin had taken his prompting to mean something else entirely. Assuming that Garrett wanted a level of control over the queen, not realizing the effect that Five Blooms already had, he kicked himself for not being clearer. Garrett could only watch as Queen Eloise, ruler of Insomnium, took the mask and placed it on her face. The power of the throne surged as Garrett reluctantly accepted the prompt. Though he had been hoping to keep the position of chosen to acquire another fighter, he had to admit this wasn't a bad choice. The queen's influence went far beyond even his in the waking world, and she would be a powerful addition to their forces, especially since she had the ear of the only manifesting stage warrior in the entire city. This was especially important since, even when Garrett became a manifester himself, he wouldn't be able to plant soul seeds in Duke Arkoff. Much like with Jero, he would have to take a roundabout tack. Currently, that was the queen. As he watched, he saw the queen's soul spark continue to solidify. She had only been at the early lighting stage, though the power from the crown she wore had drastically improved the amount and the density of the energy her soul spark possessed. Now, with the addition of the Dreamer's Throne, her soul spark advanced into the middle of the lighting stage, giving her a qualitative increase in power. Queen Eloise marveled at the energy pouring through her as Garrett waved his hand, merging the version of the stone hall he and Eloise were in with the version where everyone else waited. Jero, who had clearly been prepped by Rin, was the first to step forward and greet the queen. "Hello," she said with a nod. "My name is Jero." "Hi, I'm Eloise." "And you both know me," Rin said, practically bouncing over. The throne was currently empty, so the three women began to chat as Rin and Jero introduced Eloise to the dream world. Garrett had retreated to the Dreamer's Throne, and there he sat, looking over his kingdom. He had no idea what sort of change bringing Queen Eloise into the fold would cause, but he knew it would be significant. The last few months had been packed, and he felt like every week had brought massive changes to both his growing kingdom and himself. Pausing, Garrett suddenly laughed. Rin had called him the king of the Klein family, and he hadn't noticed, but he had actually started to think of himself as such. "Set your head straight, Garrett," he said out loud. For a moment, he sat quietly, ruthlessly eliminating any feelings of pride from his heart, and when he opened his eyes, they were calm and cold once more. The territory under his control now stretched from one end of the city diagonally to the other. There were still three main areas outside his control. To the north, the burning pain of Gath sent his strange chosen to roam the streets, slaying nightmares whenever they were found. To the northwest of the nobles' district was the Odd Sword Forest, full of living armor, but no ruler, while south, In the slums, the swarm of McTess held sway. Garrett's territory had expanded to include the palace, and even now he could feel it thrumming with power. The mind crystal had been integrated onto the throne, thanks to a combination of the Queen's aura allowing the Dream Seeds access to the crystal itself, and Ren's attack. Though the crystal hadn't rejected the Dream Seeds, Garrett had found it impossible to have them infiltrate the center of the mind crystal, where its control structure actually lay. When Ren had attacked it, however, it had unleashed its energy in a blast, destroying everything outside of it. In that brief moment, Garrett had been able to command the dream flowers to move further in, sealing them inside the crystal as it withdrew its defenses. Once inside, the flowers had exactly the same effect on the mind crystal as they would have had on a person's mind. And as each of the flowers reached 5 blooms, Garrett found his control over the crystal solidifying. That had been how he was able to channel its energy into erasing the haze his father had introduced, as well as marking the flower ghouls as allies instead of enemies. Even now, he could feel it shining brightly in his mind, as it kept the palace safe. These flowers are a cheat, if there ever was one. The next day, Garrett was startled to find a visitor waiting for him in his office after he got up. Standing in front of the mirror, staring intently at it, was Duke Arkoff. His burly body was even thicker in the fur coat he wore. Garrett was genuinely surprised to see him, as he hadn't been alerted by any of the flowers that the Duke had arrived, and seeing him frown seemed to please the Duke immensely. "I wanted to have a private conversation with you," the Duke said, flashing a grin at Garrett that made him swallow. "Come along." Before Garrett could say a thing, the Duke was behind him, gripping the handles of his wheelchair. A moment later, they weren't even in the inn anymore, but instead were standing above the city. Noticing the white-knuckled grip Garrett had on the armrest of the wheelchair, the Duke laughed. "Afraid of heights?" "No," Garrett said, his voice tense. "I'm afraid of hitting the ground really hard." "Huh?" Spoken like a wise man. "It's not the fall that'll kill you. It's the stop at the end. Still, at least up here we won't be disturbed." Letting go of the handles of Garrett's wheelchair, the Duke walked around beside him and crouched down, treating the earth as if it was solid ground, causing Garrett's heart to tremble. He had always imagined that the power of a manifestor was strong, but never in a million years had he considered that they'd be able to do something like this. Looking over the city below, the Duke's eyes slowly rose into the distance. The sun was still coming up over the swamp in front of them, casting warm light through the cloudless sky, filling the earth with long shadows. "I've never liked your type. Always scheming, hiding in the darkness, never revealing your strength. Though I must admit that you have a boldness that quite captures my fancy." Though the Duke wasn't looking at him, Garrett could feel the power behind each and every one of his words. "You know, the throne should have been mine. My brother and I were twins, and technically I was born first. I learned really early, though, that I wasn't suited to the balance required of a king. My preference is to kill my enemy, chop them up with my sword until there's nothing left. And so, with the help of my younger brother, I pulled the only scheme I've ever participated in my life. My brother and I switched our records, making him the elder. We got our wish, or at least I did. I was free to go and fight. He became king. When I returned from war, after many bloody years of conflict, he had been married, had a family, a beautiful little girl, and a handsome son." Pausing for a moment, Duke Arkoff clenched his jaw. "So why do I tell you this? I tell you this because, had we not switched our records, had I not become the younger, it would have been me who died, and he would be here now, having this conversation with you. But, what we do has a tremendous impact on our futures, an impact that we cannot ever guess. My brother took an assassin's blade that by all rights was mine, and the only thing that remains of my brother is that sweet daughter of his." Duke Arkoff's voice grew cold as he slowly turned to stare at Garrett. "Know this. Should you prove false like your father, I will not scheme against you. Instead, I will tear you apart inch by excruciating inch, and I will obliterate everything that you have touched in this world, until even the memory of you no longer exists." It was hard to know what to say in face of such a threat, but the Duke didn't seem to want a response. After he delivered it, he smiled and looked into the distance once more, and Garrett remained silent beside him until the Duke pointed at a dot barely visible on the horizon. "Do you see that? The other end of the swamp? Do you know what that is? Is that Port Reverie?" "Yes, it's Port Reverie. Once an ally. Now, well, who knows? The Queen is going to be making a trip there in a few weeks, as tradition demands of a newly crowned ruler of our fair city. I have to stay here to guard against the beasts from the mountains. You'll go with her, advise her, and protect her." "I don't suppose I can refuse?" Garrett asked. "Absolutely not," replied the Duke, "but as a thank you for your willingness to support the princess, I've decided to take you under my wing." In the next moment, Garrett found himself back in his office. The Duke was nowhere to be found, and the only thing that lingered from the strange time he had just spent in midair was the memory and a token with a sword on it that lay in his palm. Gripping the token tightly, Garrett took a deep breath as he heard the Duke's voice echoing in his ears. "I can tell that you've reached the edge, but stepping over it is a tremendously difficult matter that requires circumstances that may never happen in a person's lifetime. In exchange for helping the princess, I'll teach you what I know about the manifesting stage and how to unlock its secrets. From now on, you are the disciple of Arkhov, Bloodless Blade." When Rin poked her head into the room a moment later, Garrett was still staring at the token, his expression a mixture of amusement and frustration. "Should I come back later?" she asked. With an annoyed sigh, Garrett tossed the token onto his desk and shook his head. "No, come in. I have something to talk to you about." "Sure, what's on your mind? Remember how you've been talking about going to Port Reverie? Well, our trip just got moved up. In a couple weeks the princess is heading over there for some sort of diplomatic mission, and we got volunteered to go with her." "Wait, you said we? You're coming?" "Only because a musclehead idiot with entirely too much free time said I have to," Garrett said, glowering at the token on his desk. "This is fantastic," Rin said, laughing. "I can't wait to show you around." Slowly, Garrett's expression eased and a small smile flitted onto his face. Ever since he had come to this world, he had been hiding here in this small inn, tied by necessity to the Dreamer's throne and the tremendous power it contained. Finally, however, he felt as if he was starting to break free from his shell. He had proven to himself that he could go toe-to-toe with other great rulers, even when he wasn't sitting on the throne. He had been tested and come out ahead. The thought of traveling to another city and leaving the safety of the Dreamer's throne behind was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating, but Garrett knew that it was time to spread his wings. To be continued.